All right, Lisa, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Rue. How's it going? I'm doing well.
Good. All right. So for everybody on, we've got Lisa Lundegard on. She is a manager of pre-sales at Unqork. Lisa and I have actually worked a little bit together in the past, but Lisa, you are based in London. But one of the reasons why I'm super excited for this is you have worked all over the world. So I want to get into that a little bit more today. Can you talk just a little bit, real briefly, about your current role before we get into it?
Sure. Yeah. For a little bit of context, I'm currently a manager at Unqork in the pre-sales team. I'm based in London, as Rue mentioned, but I cover a lot of global verticals. So primarily right now, focusing on financial services and insurance globally. And I also have an offshore team in India as well that helps support my team.
That's awesome. How did you get into pre-sales initially?
Great question. So I actually started out in implementation. And as several folks in implementation usually do, they find themselves on the bench. And so at the time, I was working at a company that was quite small in size. And being on the bench, I had the opportunity actually to shadow a lot of our sales team because they would say, "We don't have anyone to handle the technical questions. Can you just tag along to this meeting?" So I raised my hand, volunteered for a lot of various different meetings, spent a lot of time on different trains, traveling throughout the UK actually. And as a result of being able to have that opportunity, after a couple months, they asked if I wanted to join the pre-sales team. There's only about two or three individuals on the team at the time. So I joined as one of the founding members, actually, of that sales engineering team. And one of the things that I very quickly realized was in comparison to implementation, in implementation, if you got stuck on a bad project, it could be 6 months of a very long, difficult engagement. But if you had a bad meeting in pre-sales, it was just a bad meeting. It was just that you kind of wipe the slate clean and start fresh the next day. And so very quickly fell in love with pre-sales, but that's essentially how I got here.
It's funny because I came from consulting as well, and I definitely hear you around the bad meeting thing. It's funny in consulting or professional services, you're still getting paid, even if there's that bad meeting. In sales, it's uh-oh.
Yeah, exactly. But with
Um,
that bad meeting, you often usually leave with a nugget or two, right? So you very quickly know if you need to disqualify out or if there's an opportunity for you to turn it around. So I mean, you learn. It's that's the fun part of it, right? Is that you get to think on your feet, you get to learn, and you move on.
yeah, no real set roadmap. On that note, I'd love if you could walk us through maybe like what is your favorite memory or even worst memory, most memorable thing from being in a pre-sales role or sales engineering role?
I think the most memorable thing and really what motivates me now being in pre-sales is the continuous problem solving. And I say that not only from a technological perspective, but also from a business perspective. And when you're talking to people about the use case. And so what really motivates me is when the light bulb turns on. And I've had a lot of opportunities to do on-site POCs with clients. And so my favorite sales engineering moments are always when I am rolling up my sleeves, I'm with the team, and we're trying to figure something out. And the second that we're whiteboarding something out and someone says, "Oh, this would actually be a good use case for this. Let's talk about that." Or, "Oh, could we actually add a button here to do A, B, and C?" And so it's when that light bulb turns on for the client that that happens. And that usually happens when you're on site with the customer talking about their use case, whiteboarding it. And so those are usually always my favorite moments because what that means is that by the time you actually present out the demo, the client can then speak on your behalf. So those are always some of my favorite moments of being a sales engineer.
Yeah, yeah. It's oh man, I haven't done as much on site recently, but that is the best when you start seeing them selling for you. You know.
100%. 100%. Yeah.
So the role is wonderful, but obviously there are challenges when you're in a sales role. I'm curious, what are some of your pet peeves when it comes to sales engineering?
It's a great question. I have two main pet peeves. The first one being, well, actually, both of them are really centered around kind of how the account executive acts throughout the sales cycle. I've worked with a lot of different types of account executives in my career. And the biggest pet peeve that I always have is when the account executive gets very comfortable in their role and they believe they know the answer to a technical question. So I mention this because a lot of the times what that ends up happening or what that ends up doing to a business meeting is that we'll hear a question and the account executive will immediately jump in and say, "Oh, I have the answer to that." But then as you start listening to it, as the sales engineer, you might be thinking to yourself, that question was a little bit nuanced. We shouldn't have answered that question in that way. This can get us into dangerous territory. So, one of my biggest pet peeves is when the account executive doesn't really listen to the full question or let the sales engineer actually ask a qualification question or a clarification question around that specific thing. And the second one is related to that is when sales engineers are not included in the email chain or the follow up. I've had a lot of moments where I've had to do action items or my team has had to do action items. And we end up kind of a week passes and you realize, oh, shoot, we actually didn't do that. But it's because the sales engineer wasn't actually included in the chain in the first place. So it actually really is a disadvantage to us because we're then out of the loop as a result. And that can be a very challenging situation. So I think those two things related to kind of how the account executive acts as a part of the sales cycle are my two biggest pet peeves.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I hear it all the time about the AE-SE relationship. And I think that it goes on both extremes, right? Where you have the
Mhm.
AEs that are always including their SEs, and then you have the others that are just including them kind of when they need them. But I
Yeah.
think one of the things that I started to do when I moved from from SE to AE was include them on all the email stuff because I liked having that context. It sounds like you like that.
Yes.
Have you seen any SEs that are like, no, just tell me, just plug me in when you need, or generally do people want more of the context?
I think in general, people want more of the context, but they want the clear communication of when you're needed and when you're not needed, right? So
Mm,
thinking through different stages of the sales cycle, we're definitely not going to be included in every meeting, and that's absolutely fine. But I think it's having the context of where you are in the sales cycle is also really helpful because what you don't want is, as a sales engineer, obviously, we're still salespeople. We're still motivated by the commission and making the sale. So it feels very weird when it could go months and then all of a sudden you realize that the deal is in closed lost or that the deal is actually closed won because you're thinking to yourself, how did I not know that?
yeah,
Right? And so it's a very disjointed experience. I think it's fine to be pulled in exactly when you need it, but for the overall context, it's very helpful to know as well that the time and effort you spent into something is still valuable to the opportunity, right? So then from a personal perspective and your motivation as a sales engineer, I think it's very important to know we did reach the technical win. And now we are going to go into contracting. And then if something comes up where the client decides, actually, after we have the technical win, we need to prove something else out, it's a learning opportunity for that sales engineer as well. But they don't have that full context if they're just pulled in and out of different meetings,
yeah.
right? Because you don't have the visibility to actually then do a retrospective at the end.
Yeah, and you'll see that a lot of times where people say, "Oh, a lot of sales engineers don't see the big picture." It's like, well, yeah, it's kind of hard to if we're not included on the
Exactly.
full thing.
Yeah.
So, no, that's great. We all have these ticks, and I think that's one of them. Is just that lack of information or lack of kind of seeing everything as it's going through is something that bothered me as well. Um, what is I always like to every pre-sales person I interview has something unique about them or funny or quirky hobby, whatever it is, right? What is something that is kind of unique to you that most people wouldn't know?
This is a great question. And I'm laughing because I think I'm a very confusing person, actually, to a lot of people. And I say that because I have a very American accent. I've spent a lot of my time in the US, but I'm actually Swedish. So I was born in Sweden, and Swedish was my first language. So a lot of who I am and a lot of my personality is very Swedish. But because I grew up in the South and I did high school and college in the South, I can also very quickly chameleon into a Southern person. So I say that because I've been in a lot of meetings, both in the US and also in Europe, actually with Swedish clients, where I will shift. And when I shift, I have a native accent in both languages. And so it confuses the heck out of people. But it's also really funny because I usually use a virtual background. So I travel quite a bit for work and for personal reasons. And so you'll also never really know where I am in the world. And that's usually the icebreaker question of where is everyone today and where is Lisa dialing in from? Is she in the US? Is she somewhere in Europe? Uh, where are you joining from?
It's like where in the world is Carmen Sandiego all over again?
Exactly. Exactly.
That's awesome. Man, I love travel, but it's another thing to be able to be sort of a native in three different places, something I can't claim.
Yeah.
Awesome. I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit because, part of the impetus for me interviewing more women recently is because there are less of them in the pre-sales profession, in tech in general, and then in pre-sales. And I noticed a few months back that I kind of had a little bit of a blind spot when it comes to women in the SE roles.
Hmm.
I have worked with tons of women. I've worked for women, but never in the actual pre-sales role. So I wanted to ask a few questions just regarding that because, as a man, we don't know what it's like to be a woman in pre-sales. So I wanted to just start off like, what are some of the challenges associated with being a woman and that men might not even be aware of that, we're just not even thinking about because we don't have to deal with that.
It's a great question, and I think there's a there's obviously a lot of research and a lot of women who have written fantastic books in this field. And I mention that because I think when you're thinking about women in tech, you have to think about women potentially in the tech industry and then women in sales. And then when you're combining those into like a Venn diagram, you have this very teeny tiny portion of women who happen to be in sales and also technical. And so we are a very rare breed. And what that means is that we have to take these nuggets from various different areas when we think about ourselves, our foundation as professionals and as technology experts. How do we use those nuggets of information to actually move into our careers, establish our credibility as technical salespeople, and then use that knowledge ultimately to move up in your career as well and to have advancement and growth if that is what you choose to do beyond the individual contributor role. And so, things that I think are a little bit more general to just being a woman in tech or being a woman in sales specifically is that, for example, when you have feedback meetings, a lot of the times it's really difficult to truly get valuable feedback and constructive feedback because folks that you work with might be afraid to actually give you the true feedback because they don't want you to cry. They believe that you might be offended or that you might cry or that it might end up in an HR situation if it's not delivered correctly. So it's very difficult. And one of the things that I've realized is the feedback that I get from women, either peers or leadership, is very different to the feedback that I potentially receive from a male peer or a male manager. And so you kind of have to figure out, how do you tease out the differences and how do you make sure that you build trust with that person so that you get that valuable feedback. Because sometimes it could be sugar coated and you don't really know. But we want the constructive feedback, right? We don't want it to be sugar coated. At the end of the day, we want to advance. We want to make sure that the things that we are doing are valuable, that it's adding to, for example, the sales cycle. And so if there's something that we can change, we want to have an honest conversation about it. But I think it's a little bit harder to build that trust and that foundation with a male peer or a manager in order to actually get that proper feedback. So there's a lot around kind of that spin of it. But then there's also a lot of more challenging things that are specific to kind of technical salespeople in general. For example, going to conferences and folks not being accustomed or used to you being the technical expert. So you might actually be the first person that someone approaches at the conference to say, "Are you the marketing point of contact? Do you have this? Do you have that?" And so people will also sometimes. I've been in situations where people have been taken aback because the marketing person has actually been a male coworker and I've been the technical expert. And then they don't really know how to act or respond. And it can get very awkward. So you also kind of have to build a little bit of this like patience, or for the lack of a better word, or like how to break that ice, right? Because you're walking
Yeah.
into almost a stereotype, and you're breaking that stereotype as a result of the role that you have.
Wow. Uh, Holy smokes. I could definitely see that because you see a lot of women in marketing at a trade show. You would often see that, but oh, that's gotta feel not great when you're, just approached as the marketing person, when you're trying to have credibility as a sales engineer, as like the technical person, no?
It's hard. The first time, it really um, it made me like it took me aback. Like I was almost kind of like in shock for a couple of seconds, and then I realized what was happening, and I thought to myself, "Oh shoot, well I also don't want to make this person feel bad. So how do I
Yeah,
break the ice quickly?" And because I don't want her or that person, male or female, I don't want them to feel bad for assuming something either. And
yeah,
so you end up just kind of changing the conversation. You break the ice and you move on. And I think that's something that you kind of have to figure out how to not take it personally. Things like this will happen and it's fine, but don't take it personally, and and make sure that you have a solid answer, or that you can transition the conversation or break the ice in a different way to make everyone feel comfortable.
yeah. Because as terrible as it sounds, I could definitely see myself making that assumption to start with, and then yeah, I'd feel terrible if I did that because I mean, a marketer would take no offense to being called a marketer, and a sales engineer would take no offense to being a sales engineer. But the opposite is not the case. So I could do that. And then if you told me, no, I'm not a marketer, I'm like, I'm a jerk for just making that assumption. So yeah, how do you make that? You don't want to make anybody feel that way in that sort of a situation. So wow, you mentioned something also though. The feedback. I hadn't thought about this though. So is the feedback more direct when you're getting it from a woman than when you're getting it from a man?
Yes, in my experience, yes. Or it's delivered in a way that I understand where it's coming from.
Yeah.
So the feedback might be direct if coming from a male coworker, if we've built that trust, but they might not give the context. And I think that's important to understand as well, um, because feedback can be very nuanced, and I think it needs to be a conversation. There are certain things, obviously, for a very simple example, if you're doing a presentation and you're saying a lot of ums and ahs, that's a very direct thing to say, let's work on that together. But if you're in a meeting and you deliver an example of something, or you're talking about something, and that could have been a little bit more nuanced or a little bit more practiced, that tends to be a conversation. And in my experience, I've had a lot better of a conversation with females, either peers or folks above me who have given me that feedback in comparison to the male coworkers. And
Mhm.
I'm not sure because I'm obviously not a male, so I'm not sure how that same piece of feedback would be delivered to a male colleague if it was the same exact example, and I think that would be something really interesting to actually deep dive into. Um, but it tends to be an easier conversation with females.
Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. But I definitely, I'm a little bit more careful with my words when there's not trust. I think that's part of, I'm sure the
Yes.
male female dynamic is definitely a component of that too. But when there's not trust, you can't be as blunt and as direct. Interesting stuff. Go
It's
ahead.
important. The last thing that I'll just say on that is I think one of the things that I found be really helpful and to help me actually get that trust and to get the relationship that I need with someone in order to truly get proper constructive feedback is I'm always the first one to say, "Hey, we came out of a decent meeting. I thought I did A, B, and C. What do you think?" So I
Hmm.
give myself the feedback first, and then I invite them to give me feedback rather than coming out
Hmm.
of the meeting and saying, "Hey, you did this." Because then it almost feels attacking. So I
Yeah.
almost kind of offer up and I offer up the feedback that I'm giving myself as I'm reflecting,
Hmm.
right? And then have them comment on it first. And what I found is if you're able to do that in a couple of meetings, it then becomes very natural. And they then feel comfortable giving you more feedback as a result of it.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. That is a great point, because I've now seen that where people just don't feel comfortable doing that feedback. I'm actually working with a pre-sales academy candidate on that. He said, "You're the first person that told me that." I said, "That might be because I'm the one that you feel safest with, and I'll actually give that to you." Um, and I said, "Go tell someone else, hey, Rue said this. Do you think that's right?" And
Yeah.
figure out if they agree with it or not. Great feedback on that. On that note, like, what advice would you give to men that are maybe haven't worked with a woman SC before?
This is a great question. And I think there's certain small things and then there's larger things. I think the to kind of break the ice on this topic, right? Because it can be a sensitive conversation. First thing is remember that we can't run as fast as you usually because we're in heels. So if we're going to a business meeting, slow down. Don't make us walk behind you. We want to be able to walk next to you, right? And we don't want to break an ankle as a result of running to the meeting or running to the taxi, whatever.
Yeah.
But all jokes aside, we really, at the end of the day, we don't want anything crazy. We want to be taken professionally. We want to be taken seriously. We've worked really hard to get to where we are professionally. And if we are best placed to provide the opinion as a technical salesperson in that meeting, give us the space to do so. And what is really helpful is for someone to be an ally or an advocate in that meeting. So if the delivery didn't come through or that you can tell that people didn't understand, reiterate and say, so to follow up on what Lisa said or to expand on what Lisa said, and maybe frame it in a different way, because that also maybe helps me in the moment realize that my delivery of whatever it was that I was trying to achieve wasn't helpful. That's also
Mhm.
immediate feedback, right, in the meeting. But it makes us feel like you are listening, one, you are paying attention, and you're also advocating for us. And it makes us feel like true partners in the sales process. And again, back to your point around AE SE relationship, that's hugely important because it also builds your dynamic as a sales team when you're going out to deliver something. It helps you figure out, right, Lisa's always going to deliver this in one way. Here's what I can add to that. Here's the customer stories, or here's how I can spin that, or maybe ask a
Mhm.
follow-up question to get the customer talking. And that's hugely important just in that meeting. But I think also broader is that if you can tell that something made us feel uncomfortable, you can tell that someone maybe used a phrase that was a little bit inappropriate, or that something is going to happen that might leave us out of the loop. Again, speak up for us, advocate, maybe move it to a different direction. If we're going to drinks or we're going to a dinner with a client, and maybe someone, doesn't want to stay out late or they don't feel comfortable having that second drink or nightcap. Speak up. Don't make it uncomfortable. Make it a partnership just the same way as you would do for any friend or any other coworker.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. It's a wonderful thing when you see that kind of symphony between the two
Mhm.
roles. What advice do you have for women that are trying to grow their careers in pre-sales specifically?
I would say, first and foremost, trust your gut. If something feels off to you, it most likely is. Just the same as like if you are taking a sniff of some milk to see if it's good or bad, right? If it's off, it's probably off, and you'll
Mhm.
be able to tell. Um, I think the other thing that's really, really important is find mentors, both male and female. Mentors that you trust, that you can establish relationships with, mentors that you can ping and brainstorm at any time of the day, and practice your talk track. Because what you'll find is that people might challenge you in various different ways, and you need to be sure that you have a talk track to back up why you believe what it is that you believe. And so don't second guess yourself, because if you have practiced and you're trusting your gut, you will be fine. And if it's off, it most likely is off. And then that's a moment for you to reevaluate the situation that you're in and if that's truly a situation that you want to be in.
Mhm. It's great. I love trust your gut. Just It's so easy, especially when you're in a group environment, to have people like want to change your mind. And yeah, I think being true to yourself is probably even more difficult for women. For fear of being that difficult personality. Dare I use the B word?
Exactly.
Which no man is ever called, but unfortunately, women are.
Exactly.
Um, you've alluded a little bit to kind of some of the challenges of being one being not being able to run as fast. But I was hoping you could give a little bit more around just some of the challenges around being a woman in the pre-sales role specifically. And the goal of this is really just to, if there's anybody listening, anybody that aspires to get into pre-sales or anybody who aspires to move up in pre-sales or just get involved in the kind of sales role, like be aware of what you're kind of getting yourself into. So I'm curious if you could just tell some stories regarding that, or just any any challenges that you've kind of faced.
Yeah, I answer this question from more of a reflection standpoint of looking back at my career and some of the things that I maybe did early on as I was trying to figure out and navigate the ropes into where I am today. And I think one of the biggest things that has really helped me is thinking through and trusting my gut, like we talked about just recently, but also building out that confidence. Because in the technical sales role, you will be the only person, the only female person in the room. I manage a male team, and very seldom, very infrequently have I actually come across sales engineering teams that had other females on it. And very rarely, if they did have women on it, they were usually not my same age group or same level. So it can be a very lonely place to be. But with that, you are going to find a career that is very flexible and very fantastic. But the things to call out specifically is you might have to, in those early days, work twice as hard to actually establish your credibility. And so trusting your gut, practicing your talk track, even going to external conferences or reading articles or doing certain courses on Google, whatever you can find is very important to actually establishing your foundation, because you are going to work twice as hard to establish your credibility. And I say that because if you are in the unfortunate situation of where someone speaks over you or someone disagrees with you in a meeting, they could actually be doubling the damage for you when you are trying to establish yourself as a credible person within that role. I think the other thing just to be mentally prepared for is that usually within this role, you are not just potentially only going to be suffering from imposter syndrome, which is wide and large in all fields,
Mm-hmm.
but as that only female person in the room, you'll probably find yourself in situations of where you start to almost prepare for battle, right? Hours or days in advance. So you're going to be thinking about what am I wearing? And how does that establish me credibly in this position? Um, am I going to be taken as a professional? And am I going to be taken as someone who is an expert in this field? And how do I really grow that expertise and that credibility so that when I speak, people listen?
Mm-hmm.
And you might even be thinking about things like if you're going to events or SKO, what's some of the small talk that I can do? It's very easy to approach another woman and to strike up a conversation and say, "Hey, I love your dress." You wouldn't walk up to a man necessarily and say, "Hey, I love your tie. Let's talk about that." Right. So you're also thinking through some of those like little tidbits of like, is it appropriate for me to ask them about their kids? If you don't like sports, what do you talk about? Right. Like there's a whole other different side of like just being mentally prepared around how do you communicate? How do you talk to people? How do you like break that relationship? Because sales specifically is very relationship focused. So
Yeah.
how do you actually establish relationships with people where traditionally it's been very hard for you to establish male female relationships, and especially in sales, right? Because it can be taken very wrong quickly, and you just have to be mentally prepared for that, right? um so little tidbits like that, I think you just obviously they can be overcome, and pre-sales is a fantastic career, but you have to almost kind of prep on a different level for some of this because you are going
Yeah.
to be faced in a scenario of where if you are the only woman in the room and you're sitting next to a person where you feel like, looks, you probably don't have anything in common with them. What do you talk to them about? How
Yeah.
do you strike up those conversations? And so it's just something to be aware of, right? As you grow professionally and as you grow in the career, that it can be lonely, but there's definitely ways around it. You just have to be ready for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I never really thought about that because there's gosh, yeah, when you get in a group of that size, I can usually find plenty of people that I have something in common with, but for you, I'm sure you can, but it's a little harder when it's, one female for every 10 males in a group like that.
Yeah,
What?
absolutely. And I mean, I would almost turn the question around to you, Rue, and say, when you put on a suit, have you ever thought, oh, shoot, is anyone going to take me seriously? Or if you've gone to an SKO, have you ever thought about your safety?
No. Uh, no, I put on a suit. I put on the suit that's in the closet, whichever one's not at the dry cleaners. And then, yeah, I guess, what do you mean by the your safety?
So being the only woman in the room sometimes, and especially at large events, it can be very overwhelming
Yeah.
and it can feel very uncomfortable. And I say that because a lot of different SKOs, there is a huge mentality around, play hard, party hard. And so you are trying to live up to a certain expectation, which usually comes with things like drinking alcohol.
Hmm.
And you just have to be aware of, as a woman in general, and this is not specific to tech, this is not specific to sales, but in general, as a woman, you have to take that into account of where am I going to be? Who am I going to be surrounded by? And how do I account for my own safety? And so you might actually find yourself, and I've been in several situations of where I felt really uncomfortable, both at sales engineering offsites and at SKOs, of where, we've gone out to dinner and we've accidentally gone down a wrong street and we ended up in the red light district. And
Mm.
I had folks from certain bars shouting at us saying, oh, you guys will get in for 50% off if she comes. That's a very awkward and uncomfortable situation to be in as a female if you're the only female in a group of 15 people, especially if you're also young. It's very uncomfortable. The other could be that, and this has happened to me personally, is that when you're at SKO, you're meeting, everyone globally in a large setting where people are trying to have fun, but you might actually be approached and someone might hit on you because they might not realize that you are someone who's working in a different region because you're in a large venue or a large event, right? So you could potentially be a partner or someone who's just walked into the venue. So you might actually be approached by a colleague in a different region and be hit on. And again, that's a very awkward situation to be in because that's probably not your motivation for being there in the first place, right? You're there because it's work. You're there because you are trying to establish yourself. You've maybe done a demo, maybe you've done a presentation, you're trying to network, you're meeting the larger partnership team. And that also can really take you aback.
Mm.
If someone then approaches you with a drink and says, hey, can I have your phone number?
Yeah, oh man. I can't even imagine that element of it. You're there to be a professional, and that's what you think you're there for, and then you realize that it's other people have other motives. Um,
And
oh,
that's why it's so important to think about from the male perspective, how did you prepare for that meeting today? Because there's almost an overhead, right? You've not just prepared for the meeting, but you've prepared also on a level of what am I going to wear and is it going to make me to this or to that? Right? Is it going to make me look professional? Are people going to take me seriously? We've all seen the stereotypes, right, of TV shows like Suits, of where women look beautiful. Who wouldn't want that, right? But you then have to take that into account of if you are going to be that technical person, you really have to think about all of those things as well when you're going into battle, so to speak, being going into the meeting, right? To
mm,
have this conversation. But I think that's something that when I've spoken to other male colleagues or others in the industry before, they've never taken a moment to think about that. They just put on their suit and got in the taxi and got on with their day.
yeah, that's kind of it for me. Wow, just so much more. Yeah, it's easy being a guy. All right. Well, with that said, I would love to. What do you love about the pre-sales role? Why are you still doing it? You've been in sales for a good bit now.
Yeah. I love this role. And I love working in pre-sales because it gives a lot of flexibility and it means something different to everyone. So I actually think, and the folks at Pre-Sales Collective do a fantastic job of this, of where they say, it's the best career that no one's heard of.
Hmm.
And that's absolutely true. And especially for women, because it can afford you a very flexible lifestyle, with remote working options, with flex hours. And you can also find a technology that you are passionate about and an industry that you're passionate about. So I love it because it's actually allowed me to, as a from a personal perspective, do all the things that I love to do, like travel outside of work and to tag on weekend trips to things that I'm doing. But equally, every single day is different. And so I'm continuously learning. I didn't study anything technical in college or for my master's. I have a background in international studies and French. And I did my master's in communications, but I work in pre sales and I love it because every day also allows me to problem solve. And today, we obviously have tools like ChatGPT and Google and other things where if I don't know something, I'm going to Google it. I will figure it out. And so it also is really rewarding because you're almost continuously working on yourself as an individual as well and growing your knowledge base. You're not doing the same thing every single day, day in and day out. And I think that is so rewarding. And that's why I also love this profession for women specifically, because you have that flexibility. And there's so many different things that you can do with that flexibility, to really end up bringing and when you find that right fit, I think the most important thing is you will end up being able to bring your whole self to work. You won't have to hide, right? And so if you find the right technology fit and you find a good group of people that you trust, it is the most rewarding career. And I love that because I've not found that anywhere else in the other professions that I have tried. And when I've done informational interviews with others, that's not something that I've heard anyone else say.
Man, that was what you just said around. You blew my mind in two ways. Number one, I didn't realize you studied French. This sounds like Superwoman over here. And two, you don't have to hide. That's huge. I want to into that actually in a second, but first, so you're Swedish, but you studied French. You've lived in the States and were educated here, and
Yes.
you now live in London.
Yes.
So, um, tell us about the differences between different countries and specifically like doing business in different countries, because I've done a little bit of that, but I don't speak as many languages as you do. We'll put it that way.
It's a lot of fun, and um it's actually the one thing I knew in college I wanted to do. So, for a little bit of context, I was my advisor's absolute worst nightmare because I walked into their office and I said, "I want a job where I can problem solve and I can travel and I can speak different languages and I can, you know, enjoy life, but also meet really cool people." And she looked at me and she was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. That's not a profession. Please leave my office." And so I mention that because pre-sales has allowed me to do all of those things. And if someone would have told me in college, "Hey, maybe don't study international studies, study this other thing, study engineering or study business, and that'll fast track you into this," I would have been so immensely thankful to them because it's allowed me to do all of those things. And I mention that because then doing business internationally, as much as what it absolutely sucks to say this out loud, but it's something that you have to be aware of, is you will get judged. You will get judged and the stereotypes will follow you around. And I say that because depending on the accent that you have, the nationality that you have, the way that you dress yourself walking into a meeting, the way that you either do small talk at the beginning of the meeting or you don't, if you let everyone speak at the table or you don't, if you try to push someone to make a decision on something when they're not ready to or you
Mhm.
don't, all of those things will significantly impact your success in doing business internationally. And you have to understand the cultural differences when you do that. So most people would think doing business between the US and the UK, we both speak English. It should be super easy. It should work the same way. It doesn't. And if you expect to do a very American sales cycle in the UK or Ireland, you are going to fail. It just doesn't work. You have to adapt to the market that you're in, and you have to, especially from an American perspective doing business in Europe, you also have to make sure that they see that you care about them and you care about their culture when you're doing that business. You're not just an American company who's trying to make a quick buck. That makes a huge difference. But I also mention that because there will be certain phrases that I would absolutely, I would never hear in the US, but that I've heard in the UK that make me cringe. So that's also something to just be aware of. We have really fun phrases, and there's some that make me cringe. So, for example, like a storm in a teacup. If I told you that, would you know what I mean?
No.
So, or if I say, we have to look under the kimono. So there's little things like that that also I think is really fun doing business internationally because you learn a lot more about the cultures.
Yeah.
But don't be don't be afraid to Google it as you're in the meeting, right? Like, what is this person talking about? What do they mean? Because that will happen. And so it's a lot of fun, but the reverse is also true, which is something that I didn't realize is that in like the word grooming, when you're grooming user stories, very common phrase in the US. It's not very acceptable in the UK. And I didn't know that. And I walked into a client site and I had a client actually pull me to the side and say, we have to change the word. This is not appropriate. I don't want to use this word.
Interesting.
So it's a learning experience, and you have to be ready for that. But you also have to know that whatever you bring to the table, you will be judged for. Right?
Yeah. Oh man, that's awesome. I feel like we could do like an hour on that specifically. What a great topic. I've seen a lot of that with my own business. But I just love that cultural aspect and hearing those things. I was just joking. You have it even within the US where it's oh, that's different, which, when it's coming from a Midwesterner is like, I don't really like that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. What I want to like get into some more kind of like personal stuff,
Yeah.
but I would ask kind of what is some advice that you would give your younger self now that you're, more experienced in this career?
One thing that I did early in my career is I didn't speak up for myself enough.
I've heard that one before.
I really was at the early of my career a people pleaser. And so I would sit, I would do what I was told, and I would basically, have my checklist of to-do items, and I would say, okay, this is done, this is done, this is done. And then I would think to myself, okay, I've done this checklist. Now, manager, can you please promote me? And that usually didn't work out very well. And so what I had to learn, and the advice I would give to my younger self is figure out how you can advocate for yourself. And it is a very uncomfortable thing to be singing your own praises. And it's something that I'm still working on to this day. But how do you find a mentor or someone that you trust and actually help you rephrase that? So if you're in a meeting with someone, you can say, here's the things that I did this week, but this was really valuable because, or here's the value that I brought to the business because, and change that tone and change that conversation slightly to advocate for yourself. And the other thing related to just speaking up in general is when I moved from implementation over into pre-sales, a lot of the times I would just remain silent and I would like be taking notes in the corner of the room. And after about 6 months, I realized to myself, why am I not talking in these meetings? We didn't have Gong at the time, right? So Gong would have told me that immediately. But we didn't have Gong at the time. And I realized that out of all the people that actually attended that meeting, I was the person who knew the platform the most. So why wasn't I talking? And it was almost like this light bulb moment that kind of came on. And I thought to myself, like, I need to jump into these conversations. I need to figure out how to, like, if someone pauses, what's my list of questions that I want to get answered in this meeting? Not what the account executive wants or what this other person wants. What do I want to get answered in this meeting so that I can do my job as a technical salesperson?
That is wild. I'm just thinking about it now because we're always taught like, listen, but it's almost a situation where, yeah, you need to speak up more. You're the one with the knowledge that's credible, that's going to help solve the problem. But I think that's the first time I ever told someone like, talk more. you know?
Right. Right. And I think it's definitely practice. It definitely is understanding the questions that you want to get answered.
Hmm.
And it's making sure that you're actively listening and identifying when it's also appropriate to jump in.
Yeah.
That comes with experience. But you shouldn't be afraid to do it. And again, that could be something that you do in like the 15-minute retrospective of a meeting, right? You could be in a taxi, you could be on a train, you could be on your way to the airport, leaving a meeting, leaving a client site. Um, or you could just be shutting the laptop and ending the Zoom and going for coffee in the office. Ask that question to the person you're working with. Like, hey, I wanted to ask this question. Did you think it was appropriate? Or like what I said there, did it make sense? Like, let's talk about that. Or if that comes up in a future meeting, if I say this, can you say this? Like, how do
Yeah.
we combine our talk tracks? That's a very easy thing to incorporate as a part of those feedback sessions to also build your credibility, to build your confidence as well, then to speak up in those meetings.
Yeah. You said something a little bit earlier around you didn't have to hide. Do you feel like you are the same at work as you are at home? And has that like changed at all throughout the years?
Yes, I would say now I'd like to think I'm the same person at home as what I
Hmm.
am in the office. I truly believe that I want people to know me for me, not just kind of the professional, right, behind the facade. I want
Hmm.
people to know who I am as a person, the things that I enjoy doing, um, for us to build relationships, right? And I want people to feel comfortable coming to me, especially if they're my direct employees or direct reports. I want them to feel comfortable talking to me. I don't want to be this kind of person behind a glass door that they feel like, oh shoot, I can't ask for that thing. I want to be approachable. And I think bringing your whole self to work is very much important as a part of that. But that definitely was not the case early in my career. I was very worried about how I was presented, what my reputation was. And so I hid a lot of what I did personally because I was afraid of being judged.
Hmm.
And a lot of that, I think, came as a result of just building my confidence as a technical expert and as someone who was valuable to the team. And that then eventually came over time. But when I first started working, I absolutely hid a lot of my personal self from the
Yeah.
rest of the team, peers, managers, whoever was as a part of the company.
Yeah, and it's such a bummer because that's where all the gold is. But I hear this a lot from folks. It just I didn't have the courage to be myself back then, and I was definitely that way. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, I see that stuff all too often. Be yourself. What is something? There's a lot of good advice and there's a lot of bad advice in every career. I feel like in pre-sales being one of them. But what is something that that you know as sort of your truth that maybe other people don't agree with you on? I'm curious.
Um, it's a great question. This question might be very specific to the type of technology that I tend to focus on. Um, but I genuinely don't think you have to demo the exact use case that the customer is buying in order to have a good demo. And I say that because good sales engineers can think on their feet and they can help the customer, the prospect, visualize the process. You're always going to be faced in situations of where a demo breaks or something happens, and you're not going to be able to demo that one thing that you wanted to. But it is the sales engineer who's able to take a use case that might have the same technical items under the hood, right? But not the same content on the screen. It's a I think good from great sales engineers. Great sales engineers can take that demo use case from a different vertical, translate it back to that customer, and help them bridge gap and help them visualize their process as a part of that.
Mm,
So I think you definitely don't need the exact use case. And account executives will tend to disagree with me on this one
mm,
quite vehemently because they want the customer to see the exact fields, the exact steps, the exact screen, but at the end of the day, if you are selling a platform, you're selling the technical value of the platform. You are selling speed to market. You're selling lower total cost of ownership. You are selling a quicker implementation, and a lot of that is because the value of selling a platform, right? That's the technical goodness, so to speak, right?
yeah.
Like that's what you're buying. And so if your sales engineer is able to take something totally different and communicate that across, it's probably actually to be more advantageous to you, because that conversation with that sales engineer is going to help you identify opportunity 2, 3, 4, etc. before close, because it's going to make the customer think. It's going to make them take a step out of their day to day and say, oh, shoot, that is really similar to this other process. Can we also build that in this platform?
Yeah, I love what you just said here, because there's definitely something that I don't think the average AE understands in this, where I got a lot of confidence as an SE from knowing the demo that I was giving. Is that the same with you?
What gives me confidence is knowing not the demo use case, so not the front end click talk path. What gives me confidence is knowing the under the hood and knowing the limitations of the platform.
Yeah.
And I say that because what gives a lot of credibility to someone moving from implementation over into sales engineering is they know when it's going to break, and they will
Yeah.
not push the customer down that rabbit hole, right? So what gives me that confidence is knowing when I'm listening to a customer is not the click path, but understanding what they truly want to achieve and being able to disqualify or qualify whether or not their use case is actually going to make sense for the platform. And can we configure it to meet those requirements?
Yeah. Yeah, because I think that confidence part is so important with, I think a lot of AEs think I need to show the exact same use case as the customer. But the problem is our narrative behind it is usually not as good as some of the other stuff
Yep.
that may be tangentially related. And I'm not proposing, demoing insurance stuff to manufacturers, but something related. Retail, manufacturing, they're close cousins, right? Yeah, it's an important one, because when I moved to AE, I just wanted my SE to feel most confident. So then I usually leave it to them to say, look, this is the use case. Whatever you think you can deliver the most value to the customer, go for it.
Yeah. And I think there's even small things that you can help the SE from an AE perspective do that, right? Is simple things like 15-minute prep calls. Intro your SE before the meeting and say, hey, Rue is going to demo to you next week. We've got an hour and a half. He's my technical resource, and he just wants to ask you a couple of questions to make sure that what we're presenting in this meeting is going to make sense and be valuable to you.
Yeah.
That is gold dust, because it allows you as a sales engineer to understand not just the front end, but also the back end and what's important. And it gives you enough lead time to be able to customize your script to have that conversation so they can trust you. They'll trust you already coming out of that 15-minute prep meeting, because you already listened to them and you delivered what they asked. And you came with a thought process and a conversation rather than, here's my standard demo.
Yeah. Oh, that should be shouted from the tops of mountaintops for all AEs. Just give SEs the prep call. I know you don't think we need it, but we're more confident when we get it. So just do it.
Yeah, always.
On the topic of great SEs, this is the alpha pre-sales question that I always ask every one of my guests is this. I want you to think, and I want you to immediately have a response to this question, okay? Now, the question that I ask is, I want you to first come up with a person, because that's what I'm actually going to be hoping that you get out of this. And then I want you to articulate the qualities of that person. So immediate reaction is person. So the question is, who is the best SE you have ever seen or worked with? You don't have to say the answer, but do you have one in your mind?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now tell me about that person.
This person is by far the best sales engineer that I've seen, because he has 3 qualities. And these are actually the same 3 qualities that I look for now when I hire for my team. Right? So one is curiosity. Are you super curious? And are you willing to not just be curious with the customer and the use case if you've heard it 100 times, and still be curious and show genuine interest, right? In solving their specific problem. But also, are you curious because are you learning other things outside of work? I don't care what it is, but are you just a curious person who is working on yourself and kind of doing that continuous development? Second is empathy. And I think empathy is very important to the sales engineering role, because not only do you need to have empathy for the customer going through this process with you, you also need to have empathy for your account executive.
Ooh.
Because they have a really hard job. They have a lot of pressure, and they're going to be hell bent on closing this deal. You have to have empathy for them when you tell them the thing they're trying to sell is not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
You also have to have empathy for the customer because you need to figure out how to deliver that message and to reorient them into something else potentially as a part of the process. And it's very difficult to buy technology. Everyone out there today is doing the same marketing message. Everything is the same, and you can do everything with everything. That's what you see in marketing messages, but that's not true. So you also have to have empathy for the customer who's seeing the same exact demo pitch, potentially with 10 vendors, trying to figure out who's lying and who's not, right? Because that's where it gets really important to build that relationship and for you to be that technical advisor as a part of that process. And then the last thing I would say is very related is you have to be stubborn. You have to be hell bent on figuring out what is best for your customer, right? Regardless of what the customer thinks they need or want, right? You have to figure out what do they truly need and what are they trying to communicate back to you. And you have to then be stubborn back to the account executive to say, actually, again, let's reorient this. Here's what I think we should do, not this other thing that you're proposing, and be stubborn enough and to be empathetic enough to actually change that conversation. And then stubborn also because you're going to have a lot of hard conversations, sometimes with folks outside of your team and outside of the prospects that you're talking to, like product. So you're going to have to understand your product and you're going to have to be stubborn enough to have these difficult conversations, probably over and over and over again, to get that one thing that you know is going to make a difference into something like the product roadmap. So those are the three things that I think make great SCs, but also these are the three things that I'm trying to tease out of my questions when I do my interviews.
Oh my gosh, that is awesome. Curiosity for sure. Empathy for the AE and for the customer. I've never seen that broken down that way. And stubborn, that is one that I would imagine most people would not agree with you on. But your explanation was incredible. And I'm with you on that because it's too easy to be a pushover in the pre-sales role. Like,
Mhm.
I think it's honestly our Achilles heel. And I
Yeah.
think a little bit of stubbornness is a good thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh man, yeah. So the reason for that question, just for background, is
Hmm.
I thought that it was empathy that made a great sales engineer, and then I thought of my best sales engineer, and he wasn't empathetic, and I'm like,
Hmm.
well, is it empathy? And so I always ask that question now, and I'm seeing a few themes emerge, but
Hmm.
I haven't landed on a certain set of things. So. I haven't seen all the best sales engineers. You all have. That's why I asked this question. So thank you for that. So we're getting just going to wrap up at this point, but this has been amazing. Just plenty of knowledge bombs being dropped here. International business, women, qualities of great SEs. If folks want to get more Lisa going forward, how could they go about doing that?
Sure. Yeah, I'm always happy to connect. If you want to talk about any of the topics today, drill down into kind of the stories or the reasons why for something like a great SE, how do you even begin to develop that skill set? I'm always happy to connect.
Mhm.
So find me on LinkedIn and we'll have a conversation.
Awesome. All right. Well, LinkedIn, way to go. That is wonderful. Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time here and providing us with all this info. And we will most certainly be in touch.
Thank you for having me, Rue. I had a lot of fun today.
Great.